Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for our Optimizing for Print Success live stream. Thanks for joining us here. We have Manmeet and I'm Johnny, and we'll be answering some questions that we've gotten from customers over the last little bit. Some of the more frequently asked questions, and also just sharing some tips about how to optimize your setup and other things that you can do to ensure that you're getting the best print quality and the best results from your palette and from your printer setup. One of the first things that we kind of want to highlight here was the difference between a good print and a bad print. So when we have, if we take a look at this, the picture here, you'll see this first print, it's off calibration, the colors are a bit mixed up there. But by making a couple of adjustments, you'll see that the print will come out calibrated and you'll see the final result of what we're actually looking for here. And while we're taking a look at these pictures here, we thought we'd highlight some of the recent print contest winners. So just to take a moment to explain the print contest that we run here at Mosaic, on our Facebook page, we usually ask customers to share pictures of their prints. And then every week we take a tally of likes and comments on those pictures, and the winner is the one with the most likes on their picture. We have two categories, so one that's 4 colors and under, and another for 5 colors and over. And if you'd like to submit one, you can just submit it on our Facebook group, and every Friday we announce the winners and then send the prizes, which is either $50 or a spool of Mosaic filament. So yeah, just a bit of information there. If you want to join, you can join us at mm3d.co/Facebook or FB.
Yeah, it's really great to see all the new models coming out. I think before we used to kind of release a lot of models regularly on our side, but seeing kind of what the community is making, it's really cool to see all the models coming out from the contest.
For sure, yeah. There's some that you can see, like the Peacemaker one, which is great show. There's a Batman one, a couple Harry Potter ones we were looking at. We have a couple in front of us right here that we printed recently. So the Mandalorian one is my favorite one down there. I think that's the cleanest print there. Lots of color changes, tons of splices, and came out really, really nicely. So yeah, always great to see that. But one of the things that people ask us a lot about optimizing their prints and getting the best out of their palettes of printer is what you can do before you actually add palette to your setup. So what's one of the things that you would recommend to a user who's about to receive their palette, and what can they do with their own printer setup in order to optimize and get the best chance of success?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things when you think about what can you do on your printer level, what can you do with a palette, what can you do with the actual physical setup. So on your printer side, it's really critical to have your extruder calibrated well. So that it's not kind of something where you want to be extruding 110 millimeters instead of 100 millimeters, which you should actually be tuned to, but you really want to have that tuned tightly. And the reason for that is it's critical for palette to know exactly how much filament it's using at any given time. It uses that to really calculate where does it need to cut the filament next, how much filament does it need to create for that next perfect color placement. And so having that extruder calibration down pat is just critical to help it kind of achieve that with your first prints, as opposed to having it happen as you print more and more, right?
Right.
So when we think about extruder calibration, there's been so many quick videos and tutorials of how to actually do that effectively. The top ones that I kind of use would be E3D has a great guide as to how to kind of step through that, but also Teaching Tech. So Teaching Tech has his website set up where it walks you through the G-code commands you need to send, and has great images, kind of a step through to let you know where you should be measuring from, what are you trying to look for, and really lets you tune that in. So one thing to note is not every printer allows for extruder calibration. Mm-hmm. So modifying your E-steps and that sort of thing, not every printer will allow. So in that case, we'll talk about this a bit later, but the historical modifier would be kind of the place that you want to work on there.
Perfect. Yeah, so just to kind of reiterate what you're saying there, Manmeet. So use an example of a single color print. if you're extruding 110 millimeters when you think it's extruding 100, it doesn't really matter because it's still going to be one color, one material. It doesn't really appear any different on the actual model. But let's say you're extruding 10 millimeters more than expected, and you're adding color changes and transitions and all this other stuff that's needed for calibration. It just compounds on each other, and that's where you start actually seeing a lot of these errors. So extruder calibration, definitely one of the places that we would start, and one of the things that I like to recommend to our users off the bat, even before they receive their unit, just to make sure that they are extruding consistently, just because it is such an integral part of the whole system here that we have with pallet. Besides the extruder though, what other things can users do to ensure that they're getting success with their setup here?
So I think filament setup is definitely an important one as well. You want to make sure you're not kind of creating extra strain on the inputs of pallet. So making sure that when you set up your filament, feeding the filament directly into the input that it's leading to, so you're not kind of crossing your filament paths. That's important, and then just making sure that you're not going to have that potential of things tangling or going through several tubes leading up to your pallet. There's some great setups we've had and some great kind of remixes of filament holders that kind of help make sure your filament is staying kind of guided up towards pallet. Another few good ways to set up pallet is, instead of really having it on the stand, you could even sit it down where you're feeding from down below and then into your pallet. But I think we also have some recommendations on the starter pack kind of instructions. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So on the Getting Started guide that comes with your pallet package on page 7, we have 3 recommended sorts of layouts that we found a lot of success with. Gives you kind of the measurements, where you should orientate the spools, and how to feed it right into your pallet. So a couple of tips there, and then as Mamie mentioned, we have a lot of DIY sort of solutions on our Facebook page. Once again, mm3.co/FB. A lot of users are sharing their solutions on how to get the best out of their printer and pallet setup.
Yeah, I think a few of those users, Rick Norris has posted a great kind of remix, and I think Bobby Bougie had a really good remix as well of a filament guide design. So definitely worth checking out if you're on the Facebook group. Perfect.
So once you actually receive your pallet, there's also a couple things to do before your first print, and making sure that these things are done is integral to getting the success from your pallet unit and from your printer setup. So one of the things and one of the features that we like to highlight here is splice tuning. And what splice tuning is essentially adjusting the variables of creating a splice in order to get the most consistent splice possible. So even before getting into that, with the filament that you're using with pallet, we do recommend filaments with tighter tolerances, but plus or minus 0.03 millimeters. And then also when you're creating a splice, what's really important is that once you're actually measuring it, you're taking a look before, after, and on the splice with a pair of calipers or whatever measuring device you'd have. And we're looking for a tolerance there of plus or minus 0.1 millimeters. So what we'll do here is we'll take a quick look at splice tuning with our pallet unit here. And just a quick thing about splice tuning, you're adjusting 3 variables. One is called heating, the other is compression, and lastly cooling. So kind of straightforward here, but you heat a splice, the second filament goes into the hot splice there. It's compressed or pushed together, and then it's left to cool so that it can solidify before it goes through to the filament path. So take a quick look here. When you turn on your pallet, what we're going to do is go to, let's go back to the main menu here. So this is the main menu that you'll start off with. And we'll go to Controls, and we're going to go to Splice Tuning. And on here, it's just going to give you a brief explanation of what I just shared there with you. And it's going to just let you know which variables you can adjust and what to look out for here. So we're just going to go Start. So this screen is kind of new, and this is going to be on the next firmware update, and we'll explain a bit more about things to look out for in the next firmware update. But just to give you a bit of a preview here, with splice tuning before, you could only use drives 1 and 2 to actually create a splice. We've gotten some feedback from our community, and what we've done is that we've been given, or we're giving the opportunity to actually use different drives when you're creating splices. So instead of being stuck with just drive 1 and drive 2, you can actually choose which drive you'd like for your outgoing filament. So let's choose 3, let's say, and then also your ingoing filament. So let's say 4. All right, so it's going to start off here, and what we can do is going to ask us to insert filament into drive 3 here.
Might be worth taking that off.
Oh, sure, yeah. Perfect, thank you. I'm just going to drive that in here. All right, let's get this one ready here. Perfect. I'm going to get this. Oh.
So I guess one of the other things that I think people commonly think about is, should I just increase my compression? And will that just make my splices super strong? You know, the more I compress them together, that should kind of give me indestructible splices. What is kind of the problem with increasing your compression factor a bit too high?
For sure. So if you over-compress a splice, it can definitely cause some issues. So over-compression can just push the filament too close together and cause it to actually deform the tube a little bit because there is just so much compression going on. And that can lead to issues down the line of that tube being deformed and that molten filament actually filling in those gaps and causing issues with further splices or future splices. Yeah. So one thing with compression is that we usually keep it within the 0 to 2 range or so. We find anything over that can cause some issues. But with heating and cooling, there's a couple other things to look out for here as well. So if you're getting a fat splice or something outside of that 0.1 millimeters tolerance, so anything bigger than 1.85, we want to apply a bit more heat on there. And we also just want to make sure that for that one, maybe just checking that the compression is a little bit lower as well. And then also just making sure afterwards that you're checking that splice and that the diameters are within the tolerances that we suggested. With cooling, if you see a splice that's necking or thin, so something that's less than 1.65, you can see it's causing some issues and the drive gears can't really grip it properly. That's a situation where you might want to lower the heat a bit. It might mean that the filament's actually too hot, or you want to just increase the cooling so that the filament is actually solidified as it goes through that filament path. So those are two of the main issues there usually. If you're getting a really bad, let's say, next splice, maybe increase the compression by 1 just to see that, and see if there's been an improvement in the diameters in that splice. But usually that's kind of the general rule. If it's a really fat splice, we want to add a bit more heat. If it's a thin splice, we want to add a bit more cooling there.
Yeah, exactly. It's really about balancing out how thin your splices are and how thick your splices are. So that your extruder can actually feed it consistently to your nozzle, but at the same time not being so thin that it's going to possibly break apart.
Perfect. So that you can see there's a splice that's done at those settings. And what we would do is just measure kind of before, on the splice, and after the splice. And that's where we want to use our calipers just to measure the diameters, make sure it is within tolerance. So this one here, we can just test it by bending it, and you can see it's a fairly good splice. The filament's not breaking. Those settings right there seem to be pretty good, and it's a pretty good starting point before you actually start your print. So I would say splice tuning is one of those features that can be overlooked, something that maybe someone that's just starting off might not have explored the menu and seen what that option is. But it's definitely one of those things that I've been speaking to a lot of users about calibrating palette and their splices. That's probably the first feature that I'd look into once you receive your unit, especially if you are using a filament like that we maybe haven't tested extensively with. So we've done a lot of testing with Mosaic PLA, but with other brands of filament, it would be best just to run splice tuning just to ensure that those default settings create a good splice, and if not, just making those adjustments that were suggested based on the splice quality that you're getting. But yeah, so that's splice tuning. Was there anything else after you get a good splice, after you get those really great settings, you're good to go, your project is sliced and everything, what's something else that you should look out for to make sure that you're getting great success there?
So one area that people often kind of forget about is the loading of your filament into your actual printer. So a lot of printers now have sort of an auto loading feature to them. Your Prusas kind of have that in the menu. When you load filament, it will jog the tool head or the extruder automatically for you and kind of assist you in loading filament. And you see the same thing with the Prusa Mini, artilleries, and those sort of printers. So you really want to avoid using any of that auto loading.
Right.
And the reason for that is When you click auto load, it is advancing your extruder by a set amount, let's say 100 millimeters. Whereas when palette is asking you to load the filament into your extruder, it's asking you to do it in a very precise way. So it knows exactly where the tip of the filament is, so that when it's introducing new colors, it knows where it's starting from. So disable any auto loading you have. You want to manually jog the filament to the tip of your extruder, especially for your first print. As you do that and you print in connected mode, you also have the option to smart load. And smart load is essentially very similar to auto load, but it is defined for the actual length that you need according to your palette and how we've calibrated things.
Gotcha.
So you still get the convenience of it, but it's tuned for working with the palette itself. So avoid using auto loading. If you miss that feature, use smart loading.
Perfect. Yeah, so that's definitely one of the important things to just ensure that that loaded piece of film, that first piece is loaded properly. And you'll see it, if you've gone and run a print on palette, you'll see that there's that menu there that gives you the countdown. And the aim there is just to get as close to 0 millimeters as possible. But, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and one of the things that you won't really realize until you're much later into the print is when you do overload, you've essentially bias kind of where the next splices will end up, so that, you know, for smaller prints you might really not see an issue and the print will come out great and you'll think you're in a great position. But for larger prints, it will end up catching up where there's a streak in your print. You're kind of wondering, you know, scratching your head, I had, you know, a couple great smaller prints and why is this one not working out now? And it often can be retraced to overloading when you're first starting the print, and that sort of thing. So just something to keep in mind of, it's easily overlooked, but it's important to really load the correct amount.
Perfect. Yeah, great advice there. And then when you're actually printing, are there certain settings that you can adjust to make sure that you know, the splices are being fed properly and that palette and printer are doing their jobs correctly?
So when we kind of back up to the slicing process and settings that we want to set during that, one thing you want to keep in mind is that the speed of your print matters as well. So you don't want to basically print excessively fast where palette might not be able to keep up with it in certain kind of cases. So we recommend more of a 0.2 layer height, 0.4 extrusion width with around 60 millimeters per second as your starting point. You can kind of change from there, but really keeping in mind that you don't want to outpace palette where it's causing your extruder to occasionally skip. And if your extruder skips, you might end up with a streak in your print or a lower ping value. And we'll talk about pings, I think, next maybe.
Sure, yeah, and just to kind of add on that as well, I guess you'd have to adjust it if you have a larger nozzle. I know that most printers will have a standard 0.4, but we have had users have larger nozzles, and that's just something to keep in mind as well, is that the flow will be a bit higher, and because of that, it would be best to maybe reduce the speed a little bit more in those situations as well.
Exactly, bringing it back to volumetric flow and just kind of calculating, you know, what is a reasonable flow for this, base it around the 0.2 layer height, 0.4 extrusion width, and 60 millimeters, and that'll give you a rough sense of what kind of volumetric flow you should stick around.
Perfect. So yeah, as mentioned, we'll get into pinging and ponging. We spoke about this briefly in our last live stream, but we thought it'd probably be worth a while to get into a little bit more in depth here. So just to start us off, what are pings and what are pongs? So pings are essentially ways of a palette to keep calibration during a print, and what it will do is measure the amount of filament that has passed through palette, which is going to be measured using this encoder wheel here. And we're going to compare that to how much filament we expect to be used at that point based on the G-code file that was sliced for the project. So the comparison there is what will tell us what a ping is. So let's say if you're getting a ping of 95%, what that means is that you're using 5% less filament than we expected at that point. And what palette will do is that we'll try and make adjustments there to get you back into calibration. So the difference there with a Pong is that a Pong is more of the internal hardware and calibration of palette's hardware. So what it does is that it still uses encoder value, but it compares that value with how much filament is actually being driven into your unit. So that's why you'll see with your Pong numbers, they're not going to vary too much. They're pretty consistent just because it's all within this unit right here. Whereas pings can fluctuate quite a bit, especially if you haven't done an extruder calibration, if you have a thick splice or a thin splice, or any of the kind of the things that we've talked about before, that can cause your printer or palette to believe that you're using less filament than expected. And that can cause your pings to kind of go down there. One of the things that Matt mentioned as well was with the auto tuning and loading too much or too little at the beginning of your print, one of the things that you can actually look at is a pattern of pings in order to decipher exactly what's going on. So one of the patterns that a lot of users see is that all the pings at the beginning are really low. So what can happen is that you'll start off with a ping of like 94%, and then over the next 2 or 3 pings, it rises back to 100. And then it stays consistent after that. After ping 4 or 5 or so, it's fairly consistent after that. Mm-hmm. Whenever we see that pattern, what that tells us is that the nozzle's sitting too close to the bed. There's a bit of under extrusion there. Because it's just sitting so close, there's not enough flow of filament coming out, and that causes that first ping to be really low. And then once it actually goes up a couple of layers, it gets to where we expect it to be, and that's when the pings actually will try and adjust itself to go back to a consistent number. So there's a couple of things that you can do also. If you're getting consistently, consistent numbers, but that aren't at 100%. So one of the most important things with pings to keep in mind is that 100% is definitely the goal. That's great to see, and it means that you're basically using as much filament as we expect to at that point. However, what you're really looking for as well is consistency. So even if you're getting pings at, let's say, 97%, but they're consistently at 97%, you're still going to have a calibrated print. It's still going to look good. But what you can do further, if you do want to get that 100% kind of holy grail there, is that you can make adjustments to your historical modifier. And that was something that Manmeet mentioned earlier. And what that historical modifier is, it takes a collection of your pings and uses that, that information to adjust the splice lengths in order to stay calibrated with your printer. So by adjusting that, you can actually get closer to 100% so that you're actually matching up with your printer.
Yeah, so if your pings are essentially consistently low, and let's say you're in the 90 range, you would look to actually decrease your historical modifier. And that would essentially be a way to force essentially an extruder correction, where you might not have access to modify your E-steps, maybe with a Dremel printer, for instance. You don't really have access to that sort of thing. So working with your historical modifier instead kind of gives you that same control, just in a different way. So it's always a great tool to kind of use as well. At the same time, as you kind of progress through prints and give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, you're essentially modifying your historical modifier by saying, save this data, it was correct, I did have a successful print, it is reflective of how my printer is performing, and it should be included in my historical modifier calculation. Sure. So, yeah.
I think the biggest thing there is, what is a successful print, and how do we judge whether I give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, right? So our rule, especially in the first couple of prints, is that if your print the majority of it is in calibration, you might have a couple streaks here, a couple streaks there, but if the majority of your print is in calibration, we would give it a thumbs up and say that it's a good print. And the reason we want to do that is because we want our pool of data to be as large as possible. Since the HM takes a bunch of that information and then takes the average or uses that in order to calculate it, the more information that we can provide to it, the better the result will be, and the more accurate it will be. So even if there is a print where a majority of them are consistently at 97%, let's say, but there were a couple of dips at 94%, or there was a streak in the print or something, we would still save that. And that would actually help towards getting you calibrated quicker. All this information is on our website, so you can go to mm3d.co/p3-lo-hm, and it'll go over these historical modifier steps that we were just talking about here as well. But with the pings and pongs, those are the things that you can actually look on your unit during a print. If you're in accessory mode, it'll show up on your unit. If you go during a print, there's a menu there for advanced menus, and you'll see the pings. If you're in connected mode, those will show up on your canvas interface as well, and you'll be able to access those after the print. So that's really helpful if you are in connected mode. So with pinging and ponging, that's really the biggest thing with calibration. And I think that's the biggest question that people ask: what are pings, and how can we adjust them, and how does it affect our HM and everything? But going into that, we also had a couple of announcements that we wanted to make and take this opportunity to make for a future firmware update that we'll be releasing in the coming days, or actually tomorrow is when we'll be releasing it. And we wanted to go over a couple of these features. And actually pinging and ponging is actually related. There's actually a couple things here. So one of the pieces of user feedback we got was that the pinging list actually went in order. So it went from like 1 to, and then you had to kind of scroll down to get your most recent pings. So what we've done is that we've actually switched it, reversed it. You're now able to actually see the pings, the most recent one at the top there. I
think another one was essentially working on splicing improvements. So we found that there was some influence from the Pongs that was changing how compression was essentially being applied to splices.
Right.
So we have kind of corrected that so that it's not kind of involved in that process anymore. And we found a lot more consistency with the compression factor of our splices, which is definitely critical to great prints. So that's something we've changed in this latest update that will be released tomorrow. And then a lot with runout detection and that sort of thing. So that's been a kind of a high demand item. And you now have kind of the preference of turning it off if you really don't want to use it, where it's switching over to the next drive or anything like that. But now you also have the ability to assign backup drives, which is super useful in the case that you know, maybe you're printing with 2 colors and you just want to kind of have you know, your drive 2 be a backup for your drive 1. So maybe you have red kind of loaded on drive 1 and 2, and then maybe on drive 3 and 4 you have a blue color. So you know, 3 is your primary one, and then if that runs out, your backup is on 4. So really lets you use up end of spools, which is always useful as well, and get more out of the spools that you're purchasing.
For sure. Yeah, and then there's the reassigned drives. Oh, also, one thing that we did want to mention as well is that we do see the user questions that are popping up. We'll address about the end of or at the end of the live stream or near the end there, but just for now, we'll just wanted to focus on these firmware updates that we wanted to announce here. But the reassigned drives option as well for when you're actually creating a print. So there's been times where you slice a project, you have 4 colors that you have lined up and that you've assigned, but then you find out that they're actually not lined up in your palette. So what's the best way of actually reassigning those? And before you'd have to reslice it or find another way of actually doing it over again, maybe unloading everything and then reloading everything. So what we've been able to do here is actually allow you to reassign drives right from the palette menu. Don't want to move that around. Got caught?
Yeah.
Oh, these wires. Alrighty. So let's go back here. And then if we start a print, let's just get one of the prints that's locally stored on palette here. This top one, a classic keychain. So what will happen here? Oh. This chair is wreaking havoc.
All right. So.
All right. All right. We're back. All right. So if we go to Actions and then Advanced Start, you can actually reassign colors here. So you'll see there's drives 1 and 2, and what you'll do is you'll click on the drive that you want to reassign. So let's say the first one, and then we can reassign it to one of the open ones. So you can go to 3, we can move 2 over to 4, and 4 back to 1.
That just saves you that step of having to reslice the project. Instead, you can kind of just reassign it from the actual palette itself and kind of just get ready to go on your print.
Exactly right. And then another option here from this Advanced Start menu is the backup drives, as Manmeet spoke about before. So what you would do is...
Take that up a little.
Yeah, no worries. We'll take the first drive, and then from here you can actually assign which drives you'd like to be as your backup drive. So you can put the third one, and then also if you want to have, there's a couple of smaller spools or it's a really big print that uses a lot of that first color, you can still also just select 2 of the drives there as well. And then if you'd like to just get rid of it, you can press X. Same with drive 2, you can just assign them over here if you need to. So that's a backup drive there.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's something that's been asked, and that will be released in the firmware update tomorrow. All right. Aside from that,
Yeah, I think aside from that, the firmware update has a lot of UI kind of improvements as well in terms of just kind of the screen workflows and kind of how you're moving this through things. One big one was the extruder modifications. So when you actually choose the option that, I have modified my extruder, it's, this special kind of combo. Previously, it would actually load up the preset for that particular printer brand, and it wouldn't let you modify it. So we have altered that to allow you to kind of get into that and actually modify it properly. On the canvas side, we've also changed things where there's now a file transfer progress bar, so you get more of a sense of how much has it sent over so far, and you're not kind of wondering has it sent or has it not sent yet. But yeah, I think other than that, those are really the core things on this update. Definitely a lot more kind of going on in the background for our next update. So one larger area there is, again, runout detection during a print. Sometimes you will have a filament that backs out and your printer might not, your palette might not continue on, thinking that it's run out of filament. So what the team is working on there is essentially allowing you to pause the printer when something like that occurs and then be there manually to kind of put it back in and then hit resume and actually continue your print. And that's just kind of helping you ensure that you're able to actually complete your print instead of something minor like that kind of messing things up. So that's definitely a big one. And I think a really exciting one is the webcam support. So it's always good to check in on what's going on your printer without having to walk up to it. So we have been testing this extensively in terms of what cameras can we support. So all the popular cameras that you see with things like Octoprint and whatnot, we have tested those, Logitech cameras and whatnot. So the Logitech C270, one that I use quite a bit, that works fine. And what that really allows you to do now is you don't actually need to be on your home network to see what's going on with your print. So even if you're out, you can log in and quickly look on your Canvas kind of dashboard to see what's going on with your print. With other kind of setups, you either have to set up a special plugin or something like that. Here it's all natively kind of built in for you, and all that kind of security level is kind of put together for you. So it's a really great kind of addition to the workflow.
That's great. Yeah, and one last thing as well that we're working on is P2PP file transfer. So it's something that's been asked from the community as well, and that will be available in a future update that will be coming soon. And we'll be sure to release more information once that's available. So before we actually get into some of the questions that we've gotten from the live stream, just wanted to also give a quick shipping update for some of our users here. So the ocean freight shipments, the people who during the pre-sale and even afterwards who selected the ocean freight shipment option, the good news is that the US shipment has arrived and passed through customs. It is on the way to our warehouse. And usually it does take a couple of business days for the logistical tasks to go through. So unpacking, adding it to inventory, repacking for shipping. And then shortly after that, users should expect to get a tracking number through their email. Now, in terms of the EU shipment, and that's for shipments that are worldwide and outside North America, that one is currently at the port and going through the customs process. So it really depends on how quickly we can get through that process, but shortly after that, same sort of thing, a couple of business days for it to be transported to our warehouse in the Netherlands, and then from there, the logistical tasks before we can actually ship out things and update things with the tracking number. But yeah, just wanted to provide that quick update and thank everyone for their patience, especially during this crazy time with the ocean freight shipping, and it seems to be affecting everybody, and we're no different. But we do appreciate everyone's patience and understanding throughout that time. But now's probably a good time to go through some of the questions that we got in the live stream here. So let's see what we got here.
So I think one is, would all features kind of work in a offline mode instead of the connected mode, which we recommend. So you do still have quite a lot of those abilities. Some of the things you don't have control over, and the reason for this is that in offline mode, you no longer have a dedicated connection to the printer. So you cannot send commands like pause or read back certain statuses and that sort of thing. So you wouldn't have access to control your printer, preheat it, or anything like that, which the connected workflow allows you to have. But you would still be able to monitor your pings. You would still be able to execute a print, but things like smart load, where we're sending a command to actually jog your extruder, you wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to actually control your printer from canvas. And in the situations where we need to pause your printer for intervention, you wouldn't be able to kind of have that ability either. So there are some downsides with offline mode. Of course, you are still able to print multicolor parts, which is obviously a huge deal.
Sure.
But kind of those nice to haves, you kind of lose those by going the offline route.
Yeah, definitely. And so that is something called accessory mode, where you're not connected directly to the printer. And also, some people have asked, oh, can we create files offline? Because Canvas is a cloud-based slicer. And for that, we do have an option called P2PP, and you can get more information at mm3.co/P2PP. And what that is, it's a plugin for Prusa Slicer, and you can create kind of files off of that interface locally. So that is an option there.
Yeah, so that's a community-driven project that acts as a post-processor. You use Prusa Slicer the same way you would normally use it, yep. And you have the option to kind of just prepare it for use with Palette 3, Palette 2, all of those. But you also do have the option now to use the Prusa Slice, or the slicer
engine.
Yeah, the slicer engine in Canvas, so that you still get the tool pathing benefits of something like Prusa Slicer and Slicer,
sure.
But you get the interface of Canvas and kind of those additional workflow nice to haves. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, always great to see that that flexibility there. So does Palette 3 also offer multi-spool mode? So we actually just released a firmware update that includes multi-spool mode. And for those that aren't aware of multi-spool mode or aren't familiar with it, essentially you can feed filament into your palette, and then once a drive has run out, it'll switch to the next drive and spool that together. So it's really good for if you have a lot of short lengths of filament that you want to spool together. If you have a really large print that you want to print and make sure that you're not running out of filament, multi-spool mode is really helpful there as well. And once again, you can go to our website there, mm3.co/multispool for more information.
And multi-spool mode is a little bit different from something like backup drives,
sure.
Where backup drives, it is similar, but multi-spool mode doesn't require you to actually slice any sort of file.
Right.
So you could just be running Palette as kind of an accessory on the side that you have your 4 spools kind of connected to. Maybe you can't get a 4 kilogram spool, and it's just easier to kind of get the smaller ones, or maybe you have a lot of spools that are just really low and kind of almost finished.
Right.
So just selecting that as one of the modes, hooking up those spools, you now have a mega spool for your next
sure.
print.
All right. So another question, what about if you put a filament sensor before the extruder? So we know that a couple of printers have that option. So what's recommended for those types of setups?
So in that situation, it doesn't quite, it's essentially doing the job twice, right? So Palette actually has filament out sensors built into it. So that it's able to detect when filament has run out on a certain drive. So there's not really a reason to have a secondary point where it's also detecting that. So what we recommend is actually removing the out of filament module that your printer might have, or just bypassing it. Stick a piece of filament through it and set it to the side. Palette will take care of the rest. You don't kind of want both feeding off and kind of sending commands to your printer.
Sure.
Instead, just rely on the Palette's kind of side of that. It will take care of that, and it kind of acts as a tool that has that benefit built in. Gotcha.
Okay, yeah, good advice there. Another question here, does P3 support PETG? So yes, we do support PETG. That's where splice tuning comes in as well. With the default settings, they're mostly tested with PLA. So if you are using a different material like PETG, we would suggest the splice tuning, just making sure that you have a consistent splice before using it. And then just also making sure that you're updating your material profiles within Canvas so that, that we know that you're using a PETG filament and that the splice tuning values are updated within your Canvas project.
The other great thing about PETG is you might actually be able to get away with smaller cooldown times as opposed to something like PLA. So you might actually be able to push speed a little bit more if you're using something like PETG.
All right, great. So what do we have here? So experiencing pauses when printing multicolor. What should I do?
Sorry, which one was that?
So I think this might be connected to the Prusa firmware that we were seeing, and we actually released an alternate version of our firmware to address this. But what would happen is that some of these temperature commands from the Prusa firmware was causing some issues. And what we've been able to do is we have a firmware now that will actually address that, and it will get rid of those streaks or pauses that some Prusa users were seeing. So that's available. We released that, I think, before the new year, and that will be available on our website under firmware. So it's mm3d.co/firmware. You should be able to access the alternate one there, and that's mainly for Prusa, like Prusa printers, Prusa minis, those types of printers.
I think another big thing we want to kind of touch on that I don't know if we mentioned is there's been a lot of improvements to splice tuning for prints, but there are several other modes on palette, right? So you've got your random mode, your multi-spool mode, your pattern mode, and that sort of thing. There are situations where you need to apply different splicing factors to that as well. So tomorrow's update, or tomorrow's firmware release, will include that so that you're able to tune for those standalone modes. So it will save to the actual palette unit, and you can apply it to those pre-programmed modes that you have.
Perfect. Yeah, so things like pattern mode and multi-spool mode as well, actually. Those ones, in the past, you would just use the default settings, but as Manmeet mentioned, we can get splice tuning in case you want to do maybe different materials, or if you find that you have better splice tuning values for the PLA or the brands that you're using. So that's also something asked from the community and something that will be included in the firmware update tomorrow. Right, and then also just going back to the pauses on the print. So with the M4, okay, so sorry, that was the Prusa firmware one that we mentioned. But I guess what we can move to now is the next question, which is the best speed. I think we touched on that as well. Is there going to be runout detection pause of the printer if I just want to reload the drive? So that's one that's, you touched on it as not tomorrow's update, but the one that's going to be upcoming, the runout detection that you were speaking about. So that will be a part of that, yes. It'll pause the print, allow you to reload it, and then from there continue. So if you had a P2, if you've used a P2 in the past, it's like the change filament sort of option where you can pause it, change the filament, but with the runout detection. So if it runs out of filament, it detects that, it'll pause the print, and allow you to actually reload it.
I think there was a question about kind of a mobile app for Canvas as well. I know there was some, you are able to actually access Canvas from your mobile phone,
right,
and kind of view your prints and that sort of thing from that. We haven't put a ton more work into kind of developing out that further, but it is something that you can access today and kind of look at your files. You could even slice technically on your phone, but yeah, it is something that if we do see more users kind of using it, it might be something we put more time into.
Perfect. All right, so I think we have a time for maybe a couple more questions here. So let's see, what do we have here?
So how do I determine the best speed to run the palette when it's running multiple filaments? Again, thinking about the volumetric flow rate of how fast you're printing. So if you look at volumetric flow rate, it's related to your layer height, your extrusion width, and your printer speed. So you got to do some basic math to figure out the ideal print speed, knowing that you're, let's say, printing with a 0.2 nozzle, 0.2 layer height, 0.4 extrusion width. You can calculate the speed that you would be able to achieve for that combination as well. So we know that the kind of recommended speed we have is 60 millimeters per second, and that will kind of produce a volumetric flow. Use that, and then kind of you can calculate, what is the top speed you should kind of be printing with for a given layer height and extrusion width.
Gotcha. All right, perfect. So what is the shortest distance of filament that can be spliced? So we know that this was something that, the first piece of filament has to obviously be a specific length in order to create a splice, right? So that's definitely something that we have to keep in mind. It's slightly different for P3 than it was for P2, just because of the hardware, the way that it's designed. So the first piece does have to be a certain length, and then from there it can be a bit shorter, just because you can create a splice a little bit easier once that first piece is grabbed by the drive gears. And then able to plunge and actually heat and have that second filament actually inputted into it. So for P3, it would be 8 centimeters for that first piece, and then the subsequent pieces can be shorter than that. I believe the shortest length might be 3 centimeters, but it's around it's a little bit higher. Yeah, it's about 8 centimeters. So even for the subsequent ones, it'll still be 8 centimeters here. But just something to keep in mind, but most of the programs, even P2PP currently, will give you a warning if the splices are the splice lengths are too short. And then once you get that, Canvas will also give you those warnings, and then you would either have to scale up the print or you can do multiples. The nice thing about printing with multiples is that the number of color changes stay the same, so you'd actually be saving a lot of filament by printing multiples of the same model or even different models with the same color combinations.
Yeah, definitely. Having a larger printer in that case is great because your purge block isn't going to increase in size, right, but you'll be able to print quite a few things for that same size purge block.
Yeah, and actually just even going into some of the advantages of going to P2PP, you can use some of those features as well, like purging into an object and other options within that slicer if you did want to save filament or look at other options there. Outside of that, I think that's all the questions that we have for today. But of course, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us on our multiple channels. So we have our Facebook group, as I've mentioned multiple times here, mm3.co/FB. We have our support email, support@mosaicmfg.com. We have our website chat at mosaicmfg.com. We have our forums at mm3.co/forums. And yeah, you can reach us at any time. We usually get back within about 24 business hours. We try and get back to you as quick as possible. We have a really great community at the Facebook group there, sharing great looking prints, sharing setup ideas, sharing a lot of feedback, a lot of good support there, and also some feature requests. So our community is really, really important to us. So we'd love to see more people joining. We're looking forward to these Ocean units arriving as well. We're looking forward to that influx of new users coming in. Hopefully this will be helpful for them to get set up and even prepare to get their setup going before they even receive their pallet over the next couple of days.
Yeah, and I think one thing we want to reiterate is the print contest. So, a lot of the great prints we see every day are from that contest, sure, where it's not something you're just doing for the fun of it. You actually get a prize. I think it's
$50 or a spool of Mosaic filament. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
So yeah, once again, just submit your pictures on Facebook. Easy as that, and then based on the number of likes, we'll announce the winner every week on usually Thursday or a Friday. But thank you again for taking the time to join us today. Mamie and I had a great time kind of explaining the sorts of things that will help users find success. And once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us anytime, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. But otherwise, thanks again for joining us. Have yourself a great evening, and we'll chat again soon.